Okay, so
What are mines?
mines?
Mines are a weapon of war. They're in the ocean. The enemy, the Japanese, dropped an awful lot of mines in the waters around islands. The mines had an automatic device on them so that when the mine dropped in the water, there was a release and an anchor dropped down to the bottom of the ocean, and it anchored the mine to this place, and so that the mine stayed in place just about 3 feet below the water. So they were invisible. Nobody could see them. And after the war, my job was we on this ship we were going through and cutting the mines loose, cutting the cable loose, and the mine would pop to the surface because it would float once it was no longer anchored. And then we would shoot the mine and explode it, and that was how we cleared the minefields. When the ship would go through and cut the mine underneath the water, and the mine would pop to the surface, and then we would come by with our big guns and shoot at the mine and explode it, and that would be then we were hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of these mines. So it went on for several months of cleaning the minefields around the country of Japan, and it was and we couldn't do this at night. We had to do it in the daytime, and it was winter and cold, and we had to stand with our rifle on the bow of the ship, and we could see these mines floating in the water, and we'd shoot them with our rifle, and they'd explode, and then we'd go on and shoot the next one. And we did that for about 3 months of sweeping these minefields and exploding the mines after the war was over.
Wow, that sounds kind of cool, but kind of scary.
It was I was the gunner's mate on the ship, so it was my job to. They was tied to the gun mount in the forward in the front of the ship. I was tied there so I wouldn't get pushed over shore or overboard, and it was because the seas were rough, and we would plow through the seas, and the seas would wash onto the ship, and had I not been tied there, I would have been washed overboard. So it was important that I have stable so that I could shoot the mines and still be tied to a gun mount, so I wouldn't be swept away. It was a miserable work. It was awful miserable because the waters were cold, and we do this for 10 hours a day. We had to do it in the daylight. We couldn't do it at night. And well, it was rough.
That's all the questions we have for you.
How about, well, he didn't comment yet on, was it Nagasaki, or ask him about what's Nagasaki.
What is Nagasaki?
Nagasaki was a city on the island of it was on the southern island of Japan. It was a major Japanese city, and it was when the Japanese surrendered. We were the first ship that entered into the harbor of Nagasaki. And Nagasaki was an inland city that we went in this long island, a long inlet, and to a big lake, and Nagasaki was the city around this big lake, and this was quite an event because the Japanese had just surrendered. The war was over, and so there wasn't any war anymore. And the Japanese people were very friendly to us. When the war ended, they were very glad that the war was over, and so were we. And we entered into the city of Nagasaki, and they were because we brought in food and medicine for them, and they were very, very happy that the war was over, and so were we. So going into Nagasaki was a big event.
I just have one more question for you. Did you ever meet Louis Santorini?
No, I don't remember that. No.
I just thought that you would because in his story, he was captured in Nagasaki and just in a prison camp there. And if you did like food and medicine, I was wondering like if you might have.
I was on the ship that released them from their prison that they were in, but they went immediately, those prisoners, after we released them, they went immediately boarded a hospital ship. The hospital ship is a huge ship, and it's geared to take care of the wounded people and the people got hurt in the war. And all the prisoners in Japan were gathered up and went aboard this hospital ship. And the hospital ship, and of course there were hundreds of them, and not hospitals, and only one hospital ship, but hundreds of people were released from Japanese prisons and went aboard that hospital ship, and then the hospital ship left and took them home.
Well, that's all the questions we have for you today. Thank you so much, Grandpa.
That was I can make a little bit of a summary here because I was just a farm kid and just a few days out of high school when I went into the war. The war was just beginning, and I hitchhiked a ride on a stock truck taking a load of cattle into market in Omaha, Nebraska, and I joined the Navy there, and that was kind of a scary thing because I'd never been in a big city before, and I was by myself, and the war was scary, but going off to Omaha was very, very scary too, because I'd never done anything like that before.
All right.
Do you have any other questions?
Mm-mm.
No. How about if you had any advice for you if you should ever join the Marines or not, or the Navy?
Well, is there any advice that you'd give me if I ever joined the war?
Well, naturally, if we ever got in another war, and I don't think that will happen, but I would suggest that you go into the Navy, because that is part of the war effort, but you lead a decent life, and it's a big adventure. And as a gunner's mate on a warship, it's exciting, very exciting, and our job was we would load our ship up with young Marine soldiers, young Marine Army people, or soldiers, and then our ship would go just drive into the island shore bank and open the doors, and the Marines would go out and fight the Japanese on the island. And we did that many times on many islands, and we're landing the Marines ashore on the island, and the Marines would go forth and fight the Japanese until the war ended.
That sounds pretty exciting.
It was. And to a 17-year-old kid, it was really exciting. And I was the Navy made me a gunner's mate and gave him these big guns to play with, and it was a big adventure.
All right.
Well, let me ask a couple questions. How old were you when you left the war? When you left the Navy?
I was not yet 21. I went in when I was 17 and came out after the war was over, and not yet 21.
Okay. And what was the most heroic thing that maybe you think you might have witnessed? Did you witness any specific events of heroism?
To me there was many. Every time we landed Marines ashore on an island, it was a big event. It was a big event, and there were people on shore that were firing big guns at us, and so it was an exciting time, and we did this often. It was a really big event when the Japanese surrendered, we were at Okinawa. We had landed a lot of Marines at Okinawa, and they had succeeded in defeating the Japanese Marines at Okinawa, and the war ended when we were still there at Okinawa, the last battle of the in the Pacific, and the way that the war operated in the Pacific is that the Navy would land the Marines ashore at this island, and the Marines would fight the Japanese until there was no more Japanese to fight, and then of course that battle ended, and we would go on to the next island, and there were many of these.
Wow.
And there probably wasn't a lot of humorous times, but tell them about when you stole the general's Jeep. Do you remember that?
I'm trying to remember that. It was at on. I don't remember whether that was at Okinawa or Japan. I think it was Japan. I was still a kid at the time, and the gunner's mate. I was the only gunner's mate on the ship, and the gunner's mate was kind of a big dog. And I liked that. But
Big what?
Big dog.
Yeah.
We had this was at Japan after the war ended. I believe, as I remember it. It could have been Okinawa, but maybe it was Okinawa. I'm not. That's a long time ago, and I'm not real confident that this is. That I'm remembering this correctly, but I think it's probably Okinawa.
I think so too,
we were still at war,
Mm-hmm.
but as after we'd landed the troops ashore at Okinawa, there was not a whole lot for us to do other than steam around the island and move trips. We'd take on a load of Marines at this point on the island and move them over to another point on the island and land them ashore again, and they'd go back into war. And this is how the war went for us at the end at Okinawa, which was the last battle. But and there was the Marines weren't defenseless. They were, and particularly at Okinawa, there was an awful. Okinawa was only about 90 miles from Japan, and so the Japanese were bombing the living daylights out of us at Okinawa because we were close to the homeland, and the Japanese were fighting desperately to keep from losing the war at Okinawa. It was a desperate battle, and being so close to Okinawa, or being so close to Japan, the Japanese could send they sent hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of planes a day, and they were suicide planes, and they would fly down over Okinawa and then dive into these naval ships. Our ship was small, so they didn't dive into our ship, but they would dive into the bigger ships and they were loaded. The plane was loaded with ammunition or dynamite. They were suicide planes, and they were doing this intentionally. And they destroyed an awful lot of naval ships at Okinawa in the last battle because of that. Because of these suicide planes coming in and diving into the naval ships along the shore. That was a scary time. Because there was we really didn't have any defense against that. We weren't the target because we were a small ship, and the target was the big naval ships, and they got beat up something awful, particularly the aircraft carriers.
Was there ever a particular moment where you were maybe the most scared for your own life during the war?
I don't think I could pick out any particular. it just continued to get worse. We got introduced to it at Guadalcanal, which is the first battle of the Japanese, and 3 years later, it was a monstrous battle at Okinawa. That was a big event because it was close enough to Japan that Japan put up a tremendous fight at Okinawa, and they couldn't fight the Marines on shore. They fought the Navy offshore. They would send these planes loaded with bombs in with the intent of diving onto the naval ships and blowing them up. And they destroyed a lot of naval ships that way. And there was no defense against them. We'd fire thousands of rounds of cannon fire at them, but we'd hit very few of them. They'd wind up. Their aim wasn't very good. They were amateur pilots. They were volunteer suicide pilots, and so an awful lot of the planes dived into the water and missed the ship entirely. Some of them hit and did enormous damage. The worst damage that the Japanese did to the Navy was at Okinawa, and it was diving into these ships at sea all around the island.
Wow.
That was a scary time.
Did you think of a question, Ash? Okay, how about, I had one last question, maybe, but do you have any, or did you lose any friends during the war?
I don't remember losing any close friends. We had enough events, enough damage on various ships but I don't I don't remember losing any close friends. But most of the time I was the sole gunner's mate on a landing ship, and